The night Marcus Reed stood beneath the gold-lit chandeliers of the Grand Meridian Hotel, surrounded by men whose combined wealth could reshape entire economies, no one in that room would have guessed that the quietest man present was also the most powerful. They might have noticed his posture unhurried, unbothered, carrying the particular stillness of someone who has nothing left to prove. They might have noticed the way conversations shifted when he walked in, the way CEOs paused mid-sentence and turned, the way a sitting senator leaned toward his aide and whispered something urgent. But no one would have guessed that 3 years earlier, this same man had been standing in a restaurant kitchen in Brooklyn, still wearing his chef's coat, watching the woman he loved walk out the door with someone else. No one would have guessed that the woman who left him, the woman who stood in that very ballroom that evening with diamonds at her throat and regret in her chest, had once looked at Marcus Reed and seen only limitations. That is where this story begins. Not at the top, but at the bottom. Not in triumph, but in the particular quiet ache of a man holding his daughter's hand and deciding, without fanfare, to keep going. Marcus Reed was 38 years old when Vanessa left him. And to the casual observer, his life at that time told a simple story. He worked 6 days a week at a restaurant called the Copper Ladle, a neighborhood place tucked between a laundromat and a bodega on a tree-lined street in Crown Heights. The restaurant had 18 tables, mismatched chairs, and a chalkboard menu that changed with the season. Marcus had worked there for 6 years. First as a line cook, then as the head chef, and the regulars loved him not because the food was fashionable or because the restaurant had been written up in any glossy magazine, but because Marcus cooked like a man who meant it. He cooked like every plate carried a memory, like the kitchen was the one place in the world where he was fully, completely himself. He arrived before sunrise and left after the dinner rush, and on the days when he got home late and Ava was already asleep, he would sit on the edge of her bed for a few minutes in the dark, just listening to her breathe, before finally going to bed himself. This was his life. Small in its geography, enormous in its love. Ava Reed was 8 years old, sharp-eyed and serious in the way that children who have experienced loss sometimes become. As though grief had handed her an early subscription to wisdom, she had her father's calm and her mother's laugh. A laugh that came rarely but brilliantly, like a break in overcast sky. Her mother, Claire, had died of an aggressive illness 18 months before the story begins. And in the wake of that loss, Marcus had rebuilt their small world around two things: his daughter and his work. He drove Ava to school every morning in a navy blue sedan that had seen better days. He packed her lunches himself, never the same thing twice in a week. Always something thoughtful. Always with a note folded into the corner of the bag. He attended every parent-teacher conference, every school play, every art show, even the ones that ran long and ended too late on a Tuesday. He was present in the way that mattered, in the unglamorous, repetitive, exhausting way that real parenting requires, and Ava knew it, even if she didn't yet have the language to describe it. The kitchen at the Copper Ladle was Marcus's second home in every sense that mattered. He had rearranged its layout when he took over as head chef, moved the prep stations, reorganized the cold storage, recalibrated the relationships between the stations so that the line moved with less friction and more rhythm. Dominic, the general manager, had been skeptical at first, and then quietly, permanently convinced once the dinner service numbers began to reflect the change. Marcus did not manage by authority. He managed by example and by attention. And the kitchen staff, the line cooks, the prep team, the dishwashers who came in at 5, trusted him with the particular loyalty that people reserve for someone who they know sees them. He remembered their names and their circumstances. He covered shifts when emergencies arose without making it a favor that needed repaying. He brought Ava in on Sunday mornings when the restaurant was closed and let her sit on the tall stool at the end of the prep counter and watch him test new dishes. And the staff who were in for prep would sneak her pieces of whatever they were working on, and she would deliver her verdict with 9-year-old solemnity. And Marcus would listen as though her opinion was the one that mattered most. Because in the kitchen, for those Sunday hours, it was. Vanessa Cole had been in Marcus's life for 2 years by the time things began to unravel. She was 34, beautiful in a way that made rooms rearrange themselves around her, with the ambition of someone who had grown up watching wealth from the outside and decided, very early on, that she intended to reach it. She and Marcus had met at a fundraiser for a local food bank she had volunteered. He had cooked, and in those first months, she had admired things about him she would later mistake for weaknesses. She admired his steadiness, his lack of performance, the way he laughed at himself easily, without self-deprecation bleeding into self-doubt. But over time, as the relationship deepened and the reality of his life became more concrete, the modest apartment, the aging car, the hours that kept him in a kitchen while her professional circle climbed a dissatisfaction, began to calcify in her. She had begun to compare, and comparison is a quiet poison that works slowly until it doesn't work slowly at all. It started with small comments, a raised eyebrow at the car, a hesitation before introducing Marcus to certain colleagues, a habit she developed of describing him to new acquaintances as my boyfriend, who works in food technically accurate, architecturally evasive. Marcus noticed these things. He was not oblivious. He had simply chosen to believe, perhaps longer than he should have, that love was a force of continuity rather than condition. He had watched his own parents' marriage, his father, a postal worker, his mother, a school secretary, and understood that love was not built in the extraordinary moments, but in the accumulated weight of ordinary ones. He believed this about himself and Vanessa. He was wrong, but he believed it. And his believing it was one of the things that made him, in every sense that counts, a good man. The incident with the birthday cake arrived 2 weeks before the breakup. Ava had spent 3 days preparing it, a lemon-pound cake with pale yellow frosting and small sugar flowers she had pressed in herself with a tool from Marcus's pastry kit, her tongue pushed slightly to one side in concentration. She had asked Marcus to let her do it alone, mostly alone, and he had stood back and guided from a distance, watching her measure and mix with a care that moved him in a way he couldn't articulate, without his voice going unsteady. When Vanessa arrived for the small dinner Marcus had organized, Ava carried the cake out with both hands and a visible, trembling pride. Vanessa's response was a smile that did not quite reach her eyes, a brief that's sweet, honey, and then a pivot back to her phone. Marcus saw Ava's face change. The change lasted only a second. She was a child who had learned to absorb disappointment quietly. But he saw it, and something in him shifted, quietly and permanently, like a door easing shut. He said nothing. He smiled at Ava and told her the cake was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. And it was. And he meant it. The end, when it came, arrived on a Thursday evening with the cruelty of things that have been decided long before they are announced. Vanessa came to the copper ladle just before the dinner service, dressed with a precision that Marcus recognized as intention. She had prepared for this, rehearsed it, chosen her outfit for an exit. The restaurant was half full, the kitchen warm and fragrant behind the swing door. And Marcus came out from the back when he heard her voice at the hostess stand. He was still in his chef's whites, a towel tucked into his apron, and he smiled at her with the unguarded openness of a man who still believed the ground was solid beneath him. It was not. She told him there, in the space between 2 tables, with a family of 4 eating quietly 2 seats away, that she was done. That she had met someone. That she was sorry, but not sorry enough to choose otherwise. The ring she returned was a modest one, silver band, small sapphire, purchased from a jeweler in the West Village the year before, when Marcus had believed they were building towards something. She placed it on the table between them and pushed it gently in his direction, the way someone returns a library book they no longer have use for. She spoke with the controlled affect of someone who has rehearsed their lines but not their conscience, and when she reached the part of her speech where she said that Ava deserved a father figure who had made something of himself, the words landed with a specific, surgical pain. Not because they wounded his pride — Marcus had never built himself on pride — but because they reduced Ava to a bargaining point in an argument about money. He kept his face still. He was extraordinarily good at keeping his face still. The silver Mercedes that appeared at the curb outside the restaurant belonged to Ethan Sterling. and its arrival was clearly choreographed. Ethan Sterling was 45, handsome in the architectural way of men whose attractiveness is inseparable from their resources, and he had been moving through Vanessa's social orbit for months in the particular way that wealthy men signal interest without risk. He did not come inside. He did not need to. The car idling at the curb was the statement, and Vanessa's movement toward it was the punctuation. Several of the restaurant's regular customers watched without appearing to watch. Two of the kitchen staff appeared briefly in the doorway, then withdrew. Marcus stood at the table with the returned ring and the cooling coffee and said nothing. He was not performing stoicism. He was actually genuinely calm, which was perhaps more unsettling to the part of Vanessa that had wanted, at the last moment, some evidence that she was worth mourning. What Vanessa did not see as she slid into the leather interior of Ethan's car was what happened next. She did not see Dominic Hargrove, the restaurant's general manager, approach Marcus with a deference that went several degrees beyond what a head chef typically receives from management. She did not see Marcus respond with a quiet word and a hand briefly pressed to Dominic's shoulder. The gesture of a man reassuring someone beneath him in a hierarchy, not beside him. And she absolutely did not see the man who emerged from the small office at the back of the restaurant, a man in a charcoal suit with a leather portfolio tucked under his arm, who addressed Marcus as Mr. Reed, sir, and waited until Marcus was ready before beginning to speak. She had already driven away. She had already, in her mind, closed this chapter. She had left a chef in a kitchen in Brooklyn. She had no idea what she had actually left. Marcus walked through the swing door of the kitchen, past the line cooks who kept their eyes deliberately on their work, and into the narrow corridor that led to the back of the building. Behind a door that regular staff understood, by unspoken convention, was not for them. There was a room that bore no resemblance to the rest of the restaurant. A long table, a screen mounted on the wall, two leather chairs, a phone system with encrypted lines. This room was where Marcus Reed, head chef of The Copper Ladle, became Marcus Reed, founder and majority shareholder of Reed Crown Dining Group, the privately held hospitality conglomerate that owned or held interest in 11 of the finest restaurants in the country, 3 luxury hotel dining programs, 2 culinary academies, and a real estate portfolio tied to the food and hospitality sector that had appreciated, in the last 4 years alone, by a figure that would have meant nothing to Vanessa Cole until it meant everything. The story of Reed Crown had begun 8 years earlier, when Marcus and Claire, newly married and laughably underfunded, had taken everything they had savings, a small inheritance from Claire's grandmother, a loan from Marcus's father that came with 30 years of faith wrapped around it, and opened a single restaurant in a renovated warehouse space in Tribeca. The restaurant was called The Reed Table, and it was extraordinary, not in a way that needed explaining or defending, but in the way that genuine things always are. It simply was what it was, and what it was made. People come back, made food writers sit up, made investors take notice. Within 18 months, Marcus had been approached by a private equity group that wanted to scale. Within 3 years, he had structured a deal so favorable and so quietly executed that the industry didn't understand what had happened until it was already done. Reed Crown Dining Group was born not with a press release but with a signature on a document that Marcus signed in his kitchen at home, at 2 in the morning, with Claire asleep upstairs, and the whole future sitting calmly in his hands. After Claire died, Marcus restructured everything. He moved the headquarters of Reed Crown's operational decisions into a private management structure, hired a trusted inner circle of 3, his CFO, his legal counsel, and his chief operating officer, and retreated from all public identification with the brand. The restaurants continued to run under their own names. The group's investments expanded, quietly and methodically, into sectors adjacent to hospitality, food technology, supply chain logistics, real estate. Marcus's personal stake in the portfolio had grown to a figure that, if listed, would have placed him comfortably among the top tier of American private wealth. He did not list it. He lived in a clean, modest apartment in Park Slope. He drove the Navy sedan. He packed Ava's lunches. He cooked at the Copper Ladle because cooking was what kept him tethered to himself. to the version of himself that Claire had first loved, and losing that tether felt more dangerous than any financial risk he had ever taken. The legal and financial architecture of his privacy was meticulous. His name appeared nowhere on Reed Crown's public-facing materials. The group's charitable arm operated under a foundation with a different name entirely. His equity positions in companies like Sterling Capital, Ethan Sterling's private investment firm, were held through a series of holding structures that made attribution nearly impossible. Without significant forensic effort, Ethan Sterling had taken a substantial investment from one of these structures years before, during a period when his own liquidity was stretched beyond what his public image would have survived. He had been deeply grateful to his anonymous investor. He had sent a letter of thanks through the intermediary. He had never known who he was thanking. The irony of this would only become apparent later, in a ballroom, under chandeliers, when it would be entirely too late for the knowledge to be useful to anyone except Marcus. Raymond Cho, Reed Crown's chief financial officer, had been with Marcus since the third year of the Reed table. He was meticulous, unfailingly loyal, and possessed of the rare quality of understanding that his employer's unconventional approach to anonymity was not a liability to be managed, but a philosophy to be honored. The two men communicated in the shorthand of people who have been through serious things together: the loss of Claire, the restructuring, the moments when the market had shifted unexpectedly, and decisions had needed to be made quickly and correctly. Raymond understood that Marcus would give up the portfolio before he would give up the life he had built for Ava. He had tested this boundary exactly once, early on, and Marcus's response had been so clear and so calm that Raymond had never tested it again. He accepted instead that Marcus Reed was a man who had built an empire in order to be free of it, and that the freedom he chose to live in was not a performance but a conviction. The man who sat across from Marcus in the back room that Thursday evening, the one in the charcoal suit with the leather portfolio, was Raymond Cho, Reed Crown's chief financial officer, and what he laid before Marcus was not a crisis but an opportunity. An annual gathering of the top tier of American entrepreneurship, philanthropy, and private capital, the Grand Meridian Hotel. 3 months away. An invitation had arrived not for a chef from Brooklyn, but for the founder of Reed Crown Dining Group, whose identity the organizing committee had quietly confirmed through channels that bypassed public disclosure. Marcus looked at the invitation for a long moment. Then he looked at the photograph of Ava on his desk. She was 5 in the photograph, laughing, mid-spin in a yellow dress, caught in the kind of joy that seems to come only before children understand what the world can take from them. He accepted the invitation. He set the photo back on the desk. He drove home, cooked dinner, helped Ava with her homework, and told her, over dishes, that they might have somewhere nice to go in a few months. Vanessa's new life was, for several weeks, everything she had imagined it would be, which is to say that it was spectacular in its surfaces and hollow in its depths, and she had not yet learned to distinguish between the two. Ethan Sterling's world was organized around performance, the performance of wealth, the performance of power, the performance of partnership. He moved through it with the ease of someone who has never needed to consider how he appears, because appearing correctly has been the work of his entire adult life. He was attentive in public and absent in private. He was generous with access and stingy with attention. He curated Vanessa into his social life, the way someone integrates a piece of art into an existing collection, thoughtfully, purposefully, with clear aesthetic intentions that had little to do with the piece's inner life. The penthouse above the Upper East Side was beautiful and cold. She had her own wardrobe space, her own schedule of events, her own stylist who arrived on Tuesday mornings. She attended dinners at restaurants she had once seen in magazines, sat across tables from people whose names appeared regularly in financial news, and wore the composed expression of a woman who belongs, which is a different expression entirely from the face of a woman who is at home. Ethan's mother, a formidable woman who wore her displeasure with Vanessa like a piece of jewelry, something chosen, something displayed, made her position clear at their second meeting and every subsequent one. Ethan's friends accepted Vanessa with the calibrated warmth of people who accept most things their wealthy companion brings into the room, without ever genuinely welcoming them. She was there. She was tolerated. She was not known. It was on a Tuesday evening, 6 weeks after the breakup, that Vanessa first encountered the initials. Ethan had left a binder of quarterly reports on the kitchen counter carelessly. The way people who have always had assistants occasionally treat their own paperwork, and Vanessa, restless and unable to sleep, had leafed through it without intention. Most of it meant little to her. But on page 47, in a table of Reed Crown Dining Group's major investors, there was a holding company name she didn't recognize, and beneath it, attributed as beneficial owner, in a footnote so small it might have been meant to be overlooked, the initials M. Reed. She stared at them for a moment. Then she put the binder down and went to bed, and lay in the dark thinking about a navy sedan and a lemon pound cake with sugar flowers and a man who had never once raised his voice at her, even when he had every reason to. She asked Ethan about it the next morning, casually, over coffee, framing it as idle curiosity. His response was not idle at all. He set his cup down with a deliberateness that signaled displeasure, and looked at her with the measured expression of someone explaining something they considered to be obvious. M. Reed, he said, was an investor whose identity he had never been able to fully confirm, whose stake in his firm had been arranged through layers of legal architecture that his own attorneys had spent 2 years failing to penetrate, and who had, in practical terms, enough capital positioned in enough of his business interests that Ethan himself had once described, privately, to a close colleague, as untouchable. He did not use that word with Vanessa. He said, more precisely, there are very few people in this city I wouldn't want to cross, and he is one of them. Then he picked up his cup again and moved on, and Vanessa sat across from him with her coffee cooling in her hands and felt, for the first time since leaving Brooklyn, something very much like vertigo. Marcus Reed did not spend those months thinking about Vanessa. This is not a cruelty but a fact, and it says more about the quality of his interior life than about any deficiency in his feeling. He had grieved the relationship briefly and thoroughly, the way he approached everything with full presence and without theater, and then he had moved forward, because Ava required a father who was present and upright, and because Marcus Reed had never been the kind of man who confused heartbreak with helplessness. He drove Ava to school. He cooked at the Copper Ladle 3 days a week. He attended 3 board meetings across 2 months, flew to Chicago once for a site assessment of a new property, and had 2 phone calls with his legal team regarding the sterling capital position that would, in time, become relevant. He read to Ava every night chapter books, mostly, with strong central characters and complicated moral landscapes, because he had decided early that literature was one of the great tools of empathy, and empathy was the thing he most wanted her to carry into the world. He had also, in those months, begun to think more seriously about the Culinary Academy. The idea had been circling in his mind for over a year, a program built specifically for young people in communities like Crown Heights and Brownsville and East Flatbush, neighborhoods where food was cultural and central, and where the pathway from that culture into professional cooking was routinely blocked by the simple absence of resources and access. He had spoken with city education officials, with community organizations, with chefs he respected who had come from those same neighborhoods and understood the gap from the inside. The planning had moved forward quietly, as most things Marcus did moved forward without announcement. With intention, with the kind of patience that comes from understanding that lasting things require time to be built correctly. He had set aside a portion of the Reed Foundation's annual budget specifically for the project, and the building in Crown Heights had been identified months before the rest of the world would know it was being converted. There was an afternoon in November, overcast and cold, when Ava asked him about Vanessa. They were walking home from the park, and she had been quiet for most of the walk in the way she sometimes was not unhappy. Just processing, doing the slow internal work of a child, trying to make sense of adult things. She stopped at the corner of their block and looked up at him with those clear, patient eyes and asked, simply and without preamble, why Vanessa had stopped loving them. Marcus crouched down to her level, there on the sidewalk, the wind moving through the bare trees above them, and thought carefully before he answered. He told her that sometimes people care about the idea of something more than the thing itself. That Vanessa had cared about them in her own way, that it wasn't Ava's fault, and it wasn't his fault, And it wasn't even entirely Vanessa's fault. It was simply a mismatch between what she needed and what their life was able to give her. Ava considered this. Then she nodded once, with the gravity of someone filing information carefully, and took his hand again, and they walked the rest of the way home without speaking. She never asked about Vanessa again. What Marcus had not told Ava, and what he had barely articulated even to himself, was that Vanessa's departure had confirmed something he had begun to suspect. That the life he was living genuinely, fully, in its modest and honest dimensions, was the one he had chosen, not the one he had been assigned. He had not hidden his wealth out of strategy. He had hidden it because the wealth was not, in the deepest sense, who he was. It was something he had built. Something he stewarded responsibly. Something that existed in service of specific values. Feeding people, creating community, education, access. But it was not his identity. His identity was in the kitchen, in the car, on the school run, in the lemon pound cake, in the way Ava's face looked when she laughed. He was those things first. The rest was infrastructure. The invitation to the Grand Meridian Gala arrived at exactly the right moment, not because Marcus wanted to be seen, but because the occasion came with a reason to bring Ava somewhere extraordinary, and watching her eyes in extraordinary places was one of his quiet, private pleasures. He told Raymond to accept. He had a suit made black, single-breasted, precise. And when the evening of the gala arrived, he dressed in front of the bathroom mirror, while Ava sat on the edge of the counter in her pale pink dress, watching him with the concentrated attention she brought to things she found important. She asked if he was nervous. He said no. She studied his face for a moment and decided he was telling the truth. She asked if he was excited. He thought about it. He said he was looking forward to the desserts. She laughed that brilliant, rare, full-sky laugh, and he picked her up and carried her to the elevator, and they went. The Grand Meridian Hotel occupied the northeastern corner of Fifth Avenue, and occupied it with the confidence of a building that has never had reason to doubt its own importance. Its ballroom could hold 500. And that evening, it held very nearly that, gathered in clusters of old money and new capital, the kind of room where the conversation is always about money but never about money directly. Ethan Sterling arrived with Vanessa just after 8, dressed with his customary precision, already scanning the room for the people who mattered. He looked well. He had spent the previous few weeks managing a story about a regulatory inquiry into one of his subsidiary funds, and the management had taken visible effort, though you would have needed to know him well to read the strain beneath the surface. Vanessa wore a black dress and the diamonds he had chosen for her, and held a glass of champagne with both hands, in the particular way of a person steadying themselves. She had told herself she was fine. She almost believed it. She was deep in a conversation. She was not really listening to something about foreign real estate markets, offered by a man whose name she had already forgotten when the shift happened. Not loudly, not with announcement, but in the way that changes in barometric pressure are felt before they are understood. The room altered. It began at the entrance, a murmur. The kind that travels through a crowd, not because people are speaking loudly, but because they are speaking at all, collectively, simultaneously, about the same thing. Conversations paused. Heads turned. And then, with a composure so complete it was almost architectural, Marcus Reed walked into the Grand Meridian ballroom. He was wearing a black suit that had been made for him by someone who understood that fit is a form of respect. He was not hurrying. He was not performing his arrival. He was simply there, and the room knew it, and the room responded. Ava walked beside him in her pale pink dress, her hand in his, her eyes wide and moving across the chandeliers and the flowers, and the hundreds of people in formal clothes, taking it all in with the quiet inventory of a child who knows how to watch. She was the only child in the room, and she moved through it with a particular fearlessness, not the fearlessness of ignorance, but the fearlessness of a child who trusts, completely, the person whose hand she is holding. Vanessa saw Marcus before he saw her. She saw the CEO of a financial services group she recognized from business news step forward and extend both hands. She saw the chair of a major technology foundation nod, with deep, unmistakable respect. She saw two senators, too. Not one acknowledged Marcus in a way that left no ambiguity about the direction of deference. And then she saw Ethan, standing 3 feet to her left, watch Marcus cross the room toward them, and she saw Ethan's expression shift into something she had never seen on him before. A careful, almost cautious attentiveness. The expression of a man who is calculating, and when Marcus reached them and stopped, and Ethan said Mr. Reed with a formality that was entirely genuine, the word landing between them with all the weight it carried, Vanessa felt the room tilt. Not the actual room, the room she had built in her mind, the one where Marcus was the chef and Ethan was the summit. That room tilted, and she felt it in her chest. A slow, irrevocable shifting of the architecture she had trusted. She looked at Marcus's face. He was looking at Ethan, and then he looked at her. And the moment between them lasted exactly as long as it needed to, not long, and his expression was polite and calm and contained nothing she could use. He introduced himself to several people around them, spoke briefly with Ethan about a matter she did not follow, and then excused himself to take Ava to see the dessert table, which Ava had been requesting with quiet urgency for the previous 3 minutes. Vanessa stood where she was and watched him walk away, her former boyfriend, the chef, the man she had left, and felt, for the first time with full clarity, the size of what she had not understood. The days that followed were unkind to Vanessa, in the specific way that clarity is unkind. They removed the comfort of not knowing. She learned, in fragments, through conversations at the edges of that world she had entered, through documents and names and connections that only made sense once you knew where to look, that Marcus Reed was not simply wealthy. He was the kind of wealthy that makes the Ethan Sterlings of the world look like they are playing at a game he helped design. Reed Crown Dining Group. The properties, the foundations, the investment positions including, yes, the stake in sterling capital that Ethan himself had spent 2 years trying to attribute. M. Reed, not an anonymous institutional figure. A man she had watched pack a lunch with a handwritten note and drive a car that needed new tires and stand at a birthday dinner and tell his daughter that her cake was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Ethan's own difficulties arrived with the timing of something scriptural. A former partner had made claims about accounting practices within one of Sterling Capital's oldest funds. The story was picked up by the financial press on a Monday, grew over Tuesday, and by Wednesday it had taken on the particular momentum that financial scandals develop when the underlying truth is worse than the accusation. Caught share prices, in companies tied to the Sterling name, dropped visibly. 2 anchor investors issued statements. 3 board seats became suddenly, conspicuously vacant. Ethan, who had spent a professional lifetime projecting invulnerability, spent those days on the phone, moving from one contained crisis to the next, while Vanessa lived in the penthouse like a guest in a house whose walls had begun to show their structural problems. She had her own apartment still. She had not given it up, a small act of self-preservation she was now quietly grateful for, and she began, in those days, to spend more time in it. It was during this period that Vanessa made the call. She found Marcus's number in her phone still there, unchanged, and she sat with it for a long time before pressing call. The phone rang 3 times. He answered on the 4th. His voice was exactly as she remembered it, low, unhurried, carrying that quality of attention that had always made her feel, in the time before she had talked herself out of it, that she was the most important thing in the room. She asked if she could see him. He said he would let her know. He said it without cruelty, but without encouragement. And she sat with her phone in her hands after the call ended and understood, for the first time, what it meant to have been the one who was taken for granted. It was a useful understanding. It arrived too late to be useful in the ways that mattered. The meeting happened on a Saturday morning, at a coffee place on Atlantic Avenue that Marcus had been going to for years. He arrived first and was already seated when Vanessa came through the door. And seeing him there in a plain sweater, reading something on his phone, unadorned, unperforming, struck her with a force that the diamonds and the penthouse and all the months of carefully curated luxury had not. She sat across from him, and they ordered, and she spent the first several minutes in the kind of speech she had prepared, apologetic, explanatory, constructing context and reasoning around her decisions with the thoroughness of someone who believes that the right framing changes the weight of a choice. He listened. He gave her his full attention, the way he had always given her his full attention. And when she had finished, he was quiet for a moment. She told him she had never stopped caring, that it had not been about him, not really, but about fear of smallness, fear of the life she had seen women around her disappear into, a life of managing and waiting and hoping that the person beside you eventually became what you needed. She said she had looked at his life and seen a ceiling, and what she had not understood was that she was looking at a man who had already built the entire building and was choosing, deliberately, to live near the ground because the ground was where everything he loved was. She said it the way you say something when you understand it, only as you are speaking it, the words finding their meaning in real time. Her eyes were wet. She did not wipe them. She let them be, which was perhaps the most honest thing she had done in years. Marcus set his coffee down and looked at her steadily. And when he spoke, his voice was kind, genuinely kind, not performing kindness, but living in it. And what he said was this, that he had never blamed her for leaving. That wanting more was not a moral failing. That fear was human and real, and he understood it in himself and others. But he told her that she had not left him when she believed he was poor. She had left him when she believed he was small, when she had decided that the life they were building together was insufficient evidence of his love for her and Ava, and that some other man's car and title and access were a better measure. He told her, quietly, that what she had mistaken for lack of ambition had been a very deliberate choice about what a life should be organized around. And then he said, with a gentleness that was perhaps harder to receive than anger would have been, that she had not left a poor man. She had left a sincere one. She asked, after a silence that lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer, if there was any possibility of beginning again. Her voice, when she asked it, was stripped of performance, no strategy, no framing. Just the plain, frightened voice of a person asking a real question. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked past her, at the door. And Vanessa turned, and there in the entrance of the coffee place, wearing a small backpack and the expression of someone who has heard more than she was meant to, was Ava. Marcus had told her they were getting coffee. He had not told her with whom. Ava looked at Vanessa. Vanessa looked at Ava. Neither of them spoke. And then Ava looked at her father. And in the look that passed between them was a conversation that had no words because it did not need them. Marcus stood, and he went to his daughter. And he took her hand, and Vanessa understood that the answer to her question had already been given. He did not make her suffer for it. This was perhaps the thing that Vanessa turned over most often in the months that followed, not what she had lost, not the revelation of Marcus's wealth, not even the particular quality of his forgiveness, but the fact that he had chosen, with full awareness of everything he could have done otherwise, not to use her humiliation as a form of satisfaction. He could have. He had every instrument available. The Reed Crown position in Sterling Capital alone would have given him enough leverage to accelerate Ethan's difficulties in ways that would have been devastating. He did not use it. When Raymond raised the possibility in a quarterly review carefully, neutrally, framing it as a portfolio decision, Marcus shook his head once and moved to the next item on the agenda. He made that choice not because Vanessa deserved his mercy, but because he had built his entire life on the principle that power reveals character. And he intended to remain. In power as in poverty, exactly the same person. Around the same time, Ava gave a recital at her school, a short piano piece she had been working on since September, a simple melody she had practiced at the upright piano in the corner of their living room, with the same methodical patience she brought to everything she cared about. Marcus sat in the second row of the school auditorium among the other parents, and watched his daughter walk onto the stage with her shoulders back and her hands already composed in her lap before she sat down, and when she played, he did not look at the stage. He looked at the faces of the people around him, other parents, teachers, a few grandparents, and watched them watching her. Watched the way the room softened at the sight of a small girl at a piano, playing something earnest and careful, and entirely her own. Afterward, Mrs. Danforth found him in the hallway, and told him, with the directness of a teacher who has seen enough to know what matters, that Ava was one of the most grounded children she had taught in 20 years, and that it was not an accident. Marcus thanked her. He walked home holding Ava's hand and listened to her explain, with great enthusiasm and significant detail, exactly which notes she had hit correctly and which she felt could use more work. Ethan Sterling eventually found a path through his difficulties diminished. His firm restructured under new oversight and with a smaller footprint than it had once had. His relationship with Vanessa did not survive the restructuring. Not because he ended it, precisely, but because the apparatus of their arrangement, the events, the access, the curated world that had held them in proximity contracted, and what was left without it was two people who had never actually known each other, discovering that they had nothing to say in a quiet room. Vanessa moved back to her apartment. She took a position at a smaller firm, doing work she was actually good at, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that the work itself, the actual substance of it, not its address, gave her something she had been missing. She did not contact Marcus again. She thought about him often. Marcus opened the first campus of the Reed Foundation Culinary Academy in the spring, in a converted building in Crown Heights, 4 blocks from the Copper Ladle. It was a free program for young people from underserved communities, cooking, nutrition, food business fundamentals, and on the day it opened, Marcus stood in the teaching kitchen with 22 students ranging in age from 14 to 19 and said very little, because the room itself said most of what needed to be said. He wore a chef's coat. He had been wearing one, in one kitchen or another, for nearly 20 years. It was still the piece of clothing in which he felt most fully himself. Ava gave a small speech at the opening, which she had written herself, in the careful looping handwriting of a 9-year-old who takes composition seriously. She talked about food as love, which is what her father had always taught her, and the audience community members, city council representatives, culinary professionals. A few reporters listened with the quality of attention that children receive when they are saying something true. Her teacher, Mrs. Danforth, who had been quietly watching Marcus attend every single school event for 3 years now, told a colleague afterward that she had never seen a parent more present in a child's life, and that the child showed it in her confidence, her emotional intelligence, her clear sense that she was loved specifically and not generally. The colleague agreed. These are the things that don't make news and don't generate headlines but are, in every way that ultimately matters, the entire point. Marcus and Ava ate dinner together that evening at home. Not the apartment in Park Slope. He had recently purchased a brownstone 3 blocks away, modest by any measure of his actual resources, warm by every measure that counted, and the table was set for 2, and there was music playing from the kitchen speaker, something with a slow piano line that Marcus liked. And Ava had made a salad, very seriously, and Marcus had made the rest, and they sat together in the early evening light, and talked about her day, and his day, and what they were reading, and whether they should get a dog. He said maybe, she said definitely. He said let's talk about it next week. She said she would prepare a presentation. He said he expected nothing less. She laughed. He laughed. Outside, the city moved in its constant, indifferent way, full of people chasing and accumulating and performing and comparing. Inside, the richest man in the room was eating dinner with his daughter, and had not once, in the entire evening, thought about any of the rest of it. There is a version of this story that ends with a reversal with Vanessa restored, with Marcus vindicated in a way that involves public spectacle, with justice arriving in a recognizable, satisfying shape. That version is appealing. It satisfies something real in us, the part that wants the ledger balanced in full view. But the actual ending is quieter, and, in its quietness, truer. Marcus Reed did not need to be seen winning in order to have won. He had been winning in the way that actually counts. For years, in every school run, every packed lunch, every birthday cake, watched over in the kitchen, every night he sat on the edge of Ava's bed in the dark and listened to his daughter breathe. The money was real. The power was real. But they had always been, for Marcus, the consequence of who he was rather than the definition of it. He had never been the loudest man in the room. He had never needed to be. There is also something worth saying about the people who watched Marcus from a distance, the line cooks who had worked beside him, the regulars at the copper ladle, who had eaten his food for years and known, without being able to articulate exactly why, that there was something in the cooking that went beyond skill. The food writer, who had reviewed the copper ladle 3 years earlier and given it a quiet, admiring notice that said, among other things, that the chef cooked like someone who understood that hunger was not only physical. These people did not know about Reed Crown. They did not know about the portfolio or the holdings or the position in Sterling Capital. What they knew was the food. And the man who made it. And the way the restaurant felt on a cold evening when you came in from the street and sat down and were handed a menu written in chalk. That is not a small thing. That is, in many ways, the whole thing. Ava Reed grew up knowing her father was wealthy in ways that had nothing to do with money, and then, later, discovering that he was wealthy in that way too, and finding that the discovery changed nothing about the person she already understood him to be. She would say this herself, years later, when she was old enough to say it in the language it deserved, that the most important thing her father had ever taught her was that the version of yourself you perform for the world and the version of yourself you live with in private should be the same person, that there was no gap between his public self and his private one, no version of Marcus Reed that existed for approval, and another that existed for comfort. He was the same person at every table, the school auditorium, the boardroom, the kitchen, the brownstone on the quiet block in Park Slope, where they ate dinner in the early evening light with music playing, and the question of whether to get a dog still pleasantly unresolved. He was always, exactly, himself. The richest man in the room never is.